Summit at the... Got it. Welcome to the Science Summit at the 78th United Nations General Assembly here today, virtually, and we're advancing a dialogue between Indigenous and Western legal frameworks related to environmental challenges. And it's my pleasure and honor to be your host today. I'm Dr. Margot Hurlbert, a Canada Research Chair, and this session is opening a dialogue on the importance of evolving the legal frameworks relating to environmental change, which enable, or not, the effective inclusion of historically excluded populations, such as the Indigenous peoples, in the decision and science-making processes. So the purpose of this panel is to co-develop a roadmap to continue advancing the dialogue between Indigenous and Western legal frameworks related to environmental challenges. And it's based on our esteemed panelists' previous experiences working in the field from decolonial and anti-colonial perspectives. So we are going to have the speakers introduce themselves. So we have 4 esteemed speakers with us. And first off, we have Anna Stewart-Ibarra, the Executive Director of the Inter-American Institute for Global Change Research. Anna, if you can introduce yourself, please.
Thank you, Margot. Bienvenidos a todos y todas. My name is Anna Stewart-Ibarra. I am currently sitting in New York City attending the Science Summit of UNGA in person, but my home is in Uruguay in the southern cone of South America. It's a great pleasure to be here with you and look forward to this really rich discussion. Back to you, Margot.
Great. Our next speaker is Nicole Arbour, the Executive Director of the Belmont Forum.
Hello, everybody. My name is Nicole Arbour. I'm the Executive Director of the Belmont Forum, and I'm joining you today from Brussels. But like Anna, I am also normally in Uruguay, and I'm looking forward to speaking with all of you today. Thank you.
Great, welcome. And we have Gwen Bridge, First Nations of Canada representative in the private sector. Gwen.
Thanks, Margot. Welcome all. Nice to be here. Yes, my name is Gwen, and I'm a member of the Satellite Cree Nation in Alberta, Canada, and work as a consultant across North America, advancing discussions relating to the topic of legal pluralism. Thanks.
Wonderful. And our 4th panelist is Erman Kisepi Nyirira. Sorry, I'm mispronouncing that, Erman, the Director of Adaptation for Plurinational Authority of Mother Earth.
Muchas gracias. Saluda desde Bolivia a todos y todas. Bueno, como ha indicado, mi nombre es Germán Quispeniura, soy director del mecanismo de adaptación de la Autoridad Provincial de Madre Tierra aquí en Bolivia. Gracias.
Great. Welcome to our speakers and welcome to our participants. So we do have a micro board that you can access. And we have a few people here, so you can introduce yourself, where you're from, your organization, your name on the microboard. And I see Christine Tang. Welcome, Christine. We also, I can see on our Zoom links, we have Andrea Romero, we have Umar, Liz, Estefania here today with us. So welcome. So feel free to also use the chat. So if you're not able to access the microboard for some reason, I just clicked through to join it for free. I didn't create an account, so you're welcome to do that and introduce yourself there or put it into the chat. And that goes with your questions too. The microboard will be amassing questions. And so you can use it as the speakers, the panelists are speaking, but also feel free, if that's not accessible to you, to also use the Zoom chat. Any of those options are available to you. So we're going to get started here. We have two segments to our presentations today. We have two presenters, Gwen and Herman, who will be presenting on what the current state regarding the integration of the Indigenous originary knowledge and practices in the Western legal frameworks related to environmental challenges, what they are, and what are the main limitations or obstacles identified for an effective integration. So first of all, we are going to hear for about 10 or 15 minutes from Gwen Bridge. So over to you, Gwen.
Thank you. I'm going to share a presentation I've drafted to help guide this conversation. So you should be seeing the screen share now. So the work that I do in Canada is both with my consulting firm really
Gwen, we're seeing your notes page
Oh.
and not the other page. So if you just, yeah, that flippy thing.
Where did it go? Here it is.
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
That is better. Okay, good. Sorry, it ends up confusing me. Oops, did that go back to the beginning? Sorry. It's still wrong?
Well, you've reset it to the viewer. Now we're seeing the old view. You had it right.
Okay.
You just need to change it to...
change it back. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Perfect.
Well, it's perfect on your side, but my side it's not perfect.
Oh.
Because I wanted to draw and interact on it, but now I can't. But I'll just keep going. One never knows what they get sometimes with the various platforms. So I do work as a consultant for Gwenbridge Consulting in developing strategies to advance Indigenous law in the political context here in Canada with the provincial government of British Columbia and the federal government of Canada. So I'll talk a little bit about that context and then describe the framework I use. I also work as a co-founder in this Indigenous Engagement Institute, which is bringing forward the training components, so training governments, training others to really think through some of the frameworks that are useful in this conversation, which I'll share briefly with you today. So this understanding of paradigms, so this many of today's problems are rooted in paradigms, and whether it's climate change or any question related to equity, we're really informed by the paradigms. And a lot of the work that I'm doing is really to begin to identify some of those paradigms which are which underlay our activities. So this again is the question about how we understand these two concepts of Indigenous law or Western law and Indigenous law. So the framework that I'll talk about is particularly in the province of British Columbia and some of these commitments. So we have in the province of British Columbia in Canada, this commitment to implement the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, and in the action plan to implement the legislation for that, there's a commitment to legal pluralism. So people not really sure exactly what that means, but in UNDRIP, of course, is the recognition of Indigenous rights, including the Indigenous rights to governance and authority over their lands. And so we're beginning to explore the conversations that are necessary to advance legal pluralism under these commitments. Canada has also developed a commitment to implement UNDRIP and make all of its legislation consistent with UNDRIP through, it's called Bill C-15. They've also developed an action plan which doesn't reference legal pluralism in the same way that British Columbia does, but we're moving forward with that assumption. In the United States, of course, there's momentum from the Biden administration to really have a lot more inclusion of Indigenous knowledge in the decision-making that occurs at the federal level. And so one of my assertions through some of the work that I'm doing there as well is to say that in order to implement traditional ecological knowledge, and the Indigenous knowledge includes Indigenous law, there needs to be this recognition that these two these two legal systems are really at play in this conversation. So the following slide is how I typically try to describe what's happening in the context of the how we're having these conversations. And so these conversations are usually had in the context of consultation in whatever government assertion context, right? Well, what do you think about this project? Tell us your values and these kinds of things. And that was a really problematic approach, because fundamentally the question we began to ask ourselves is, where do people believe and behave with the assumption that they have decisions to make over the land base, whether that's their own individual decision-making sort of assumptions or assertions, or it's their organizational assertions of authority, right? And so what we did in the context of describing how we begin to see what reconciliation could mean. In Canada, of course, there's a commitment to reconciliation that built upon the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was finalized in 2015, which was really about how do we deal with what happened in residential school systems. So within that, since then, Canada has really been working towards reconciliation. And so reconciliation is fundamentally this resolution of conflict, right? And so the question we had after these dissatisfactory consultation meetings was, well, what's at conflict? What are we trying to resolve? And so we sort of peeled back this onion, if you will, to say, okay, well, is there anything in common between our two societies? And we found indeed, typically there is. The societies are built, and the authorities that we operate under are deeply held assumptions about authority and what authorities we're answering to come from this sort of the metaphysical ether, if you will, from these notions of God and creator. And this is not a comment on atheism or whether you believe in God or not. It's a comment on how the delegated authority from these conceptualization plays out in our legislative frameworks. So briefly, I'll talk about this. And if you Google Gwen Bridge, if you're interested in more detailed explanations, there are some webinars online. But what we have on the sort of Western side, and this is where I typically draw on it, I would point to God, obviously. What we have on the Western side is this notion of a creator, right? And the creator created all the things. And this, in many societies, and here's my caveat, this is not speaking pan-Indigenous, this is based on my identity, my relationships, my work, my insights, and my knowledge. So if someone else has something better, but this is a framework which is designed to help develop understanding of Indigenous worldview from the non-Indigenous lens. So this is why it's presented in a hierarchy and really creating an understanding within the middle part, which is sort of framed in a respectful and culturally safe way called ethical space typically, is this understanding of what's important to be understood from these different sides. So this, in terms of where we get our fundamental authority and our legislative frameworks, is this description of what's important to be understood. So we have these two components, God and creator, and both of those entities create the world, create all the things. And then following that, typically, the creator creates then humans to interact with the things already created. And this is where some differentiations begin, however, between our sort of North American and South America Judeo-Christian frameworks of law and authority versus Indigenous frameworks of law and authority. So we have humans get delegated this authority. So God says, well, you humans get the authority to make decisions not only for yourselves, but over all the things that are on the earth. Right? So this delegated authority from God to humans is a fundamental, deep-seated assumption about human authority over the natural world, right? On the Indigenous side, after the creator creates all the things and then creates humans, the creator then says to the elements of the earth which are non-human, plants and animals, for example, you, plants and animals, get to decide what happens to the humans. So the animals and plants, etc., get to decide the fate of the humans. Right. And so you have this a very sort of fundamental differentiation of the authority that we're running under. Right. And so subsequently, of course, on the Western side, we have human constructs of constitution and legislation and policy and management planning. Right. On the Indigenous side, we have this knowledge that's contained about the obligations that the animals just prescribe to humans, being the authority over humans. Those obligations are defined in story. This is the essence of traditional ecological knowledge. So when people talk about traditional ecological knowledge, we're talking not only about a methodological approach to observation, analysis, and conclusion drawing, i.e. science, but also the ability of that information contained within that traditional knowledge to guide the behavior of the societal participants because it contains inherent authority. And so subsequently people have their stories, which contain protocols and prescriptions, and then people get on with living, right? And so we have this different set of system built on a sort of an inverse or opposing kind of hierarchical allegiance. The challenge in some of the work that we're having in Canada in particular is that people begin to make assumptions and conflate the methodological approach of human observation of the natural world with science, right? So you have science and TEK, which are really observational based things and conclusions and recommendations. The challenge then, of course, is that people on the scientific side play within the system of authority on the Western side, which says that science then ends up having to be validated by policymaking within our system, right? And so this is characterized by climate change, right? If climate change information, i.e. what the Earth has been saying to scientists, truly had any authoritative weight to influence the way we behave, we would be behaving differently. But that information, that Earth truth, if you will, from science needs to be policy validated and then, of course, compromised through that process. So when people try to include Indigenous knowledge in science or management planning, they're in essence, and I typically draw a line from Earth or TK into science, right? We're trying to take a body of information, which while methodologically similar, has these different authoritative weights. And so we're trying to then subjugate the entire Indigenous society's authoritative and legislative structure to a policy validation methodology or process, right? And so in reconciliation, the question is, why would anyone from the Indigenous side agree to do that? So when we're talking about conflict and trying to have conversations around what's fundamentally a conflict, that question needs to be coming up, right? And we're talking about how we build new frameworks based on its understanding of legal authority is really important. So when we're moving through systems and examples of what that looks like, there's examples that we're building, for example, in the national park space, where we're saying, okay, let's really look to equivalent levels of law. So we have the National Parks Act, for example, on the Western side, which says we must protect, special places. We're looking to the same story, which provides the same behavioral guidance to the societal participants as the National Park Act. So in this case, in the Okanagan context where I'm working, we have something called Chickadee Arrow Story, which is really, we need to protect special places. So we're looking for those places, whether they're story or law, which provide the same sort or type of behavioral guidance to the societal participants, i.e. the law, right? And so instead of saying, we're going to run management planning, which includes traditional knowledge, like what we should do about chickadee management, in a management plan, we're looking to what the behavioral guidance or law is between those two equivalent legislative components. So we're drawing that out in some of the agreements we're having in Canada at the moment. So there's a lot in here, but this is really the framework for all of the work that I'm trying to do and really advance in some of the policy evolution within Canada. This is a shorthand, if you will. What this framework essentially says is that when we're thinking about how we're making decisions, whether they're regional or organizational planning or strategy or whatever the case may be, we're coming from the Western lens in this typical theory, this typical planning or theory of change. We come out of planning school, our Masters of Science school, with this deeply embedded assumption about humans get to make decisions. And, this theory of change is really predicated on, if we want a certain outcome, say clean water, there's a series of human decisions which will result in that clean water, right? And we run through them. If we're an environmental group, we're like, oh, we should do this. If we're a coal mining company, we're like, actually dirty water, different set of human decisions. The point is that all of that system outcome is predicated on human decision makings. Humans determine the system outcome, right? So you have humans determining system outcome. On the Indigenous side, you have the system outcome determining human decisions. right? So you have things like in the Okanagan tradition and others that water has an authority and it says to humans, like the obligation described in law is to maintain water quality. Water must be clean. It determines its own outcome. So the natural system determines its outcome. Human decisions are consistent with the natural system outcome. So that's why you have this, 5% of the world's population, Indigenous, controlling or managing 80 or stewarding 80% of the world's biodiversity. It's because those human decisions are predicated on the decisions that are already made by the higher level authority. Right, so you have an inverse, is my shorthand, inverse, right? Human decisions influence system outcomes on the Western side, and system outcomes influence human decisions. So when we're talking about how we reconcile that, and maybe in this context of ethical space, it's not about trying to equivocate an interesting ecological phenomenon observation and say, oh, traditional knowledge says the same. That's often the same, but it's this different level of hierarchy as displayed through decision making. Right. So the question in reconciliation is, we're not having conversations about the topical or the particular question of the day, like should we cut down trees or not cut them down. It's more about the point of conflict is the fundamental assumptions that underlay decision making. And within that, there's very many challenges and whatnot, and we need to recognize that and even begin this question of, can we build common goals around this differentiated decision making process? A couple of examples, I mentioned the the National Park Reserve proposal in the South Okanagan, which is really built around framing some of this legislative change that needs to happen on the federal side to recognize the authority of traditional knowledge. But then also there's many examples, including the Similkameen Protected Area, which are grounded in Indigenous sovereignty and jurisdiction based within their own legal frameworks, right? And then they're bringing that forward into the discussion space. So I would wrap there. I know it was very short time, but welcome and looking forward to the discussion. And again, if there's anything that you'd like to learn more about, feel free to reach out or Google and me online and whatnot. So thank you very much. Thank you, Margot.
Oh, thank you, Gwen. That was so wonderful and great with examples and rich in theoretical understanding as well. Thank you so much for that. So our next speaker, again, 10 to 15 minutes, will be Resumen. And for those, do know that you can hit translation at the bottom if you do need translation. So, Resumen.
Sí, estoy acá. Estoy aquí. Comparto mi pantalla. Si me pueden confirmar si es que están viendo.
Sí, está perfecto, hermano.
Gracias.
Sí.
Bueno, continuando con el evento, quien habla es, hace rato me presenté, soy Germán Quispeniura, de la Autoridad Provincial Madre Tierra, en el cargo de director de mecanismos de adaptación. Bueno, pues a nombre de hermana Angélica Ponce, ella está al tanto de todas las actividades que estamos desarrollando y por lo tanto vamos a continuar con nuestra presentación. La Autoridad Provincial Madre Tierra, su sigla es APMT, tiene un mandato legal que es una entidad estratégica autárquica de derecho público con autonomía, ¿no? Tenemos esa parte de autonomía de tanto lo que es administración técnica y administrativa. Y tenemos también la parte de responsabilidad, lo que son formación de políticas, planificación, gestión técnica y elaboración y ejecución de estrategias, planes, programas. La APMT es una entidad realmente muy completa, desde lo que son fondos hasta lo que son elaboración de programas, proyectos, planes, todo. Pero esta entidad funciona en base a la ley 300, Ley Marco de Madre Tierra y Desarrollo Integral para Vivir Bien. Y tenemos el decreto supremo 1696, que es el decreto reglamentario de funcionamiento de la Autoridad Provincial Madre Tierra. Las principales funciones que acá podemos ver, voy a habilitar mi puntero por favor un momentito. tenemos es formular lo que es y implementar la política. Actualmente Bolivia ya tiene una política de cambio climático actualizado. El plan, estamos en pleno ya un 70% con el trabajo de concluir nuestro plan de cambio climático. Luego tenemos lo que es planificar la gestión, monitoreo, evaluación. También tenemos un sistema de monitoreo para eso y está en pleno elaboración y ya vamos a consolidar. Otro es gestionar y ejecutar fondos de de madre tierra. Esto así en medias funcionando no tenemos total consolidado. Luego somos responsables de las políticas, estrategias, planes, programas. Orientar y definir la intervenciones y coordinación del nivel central del Estado con lo que son ETAs. ETAs son entidades territoriales autónomas, que en este caso serían los municipios y las gobernaciones. También tenemos una de las funciones es apoyar técnica integralmente a todo lo que son los sectores, tanto lo que es el nivel central del Estado, los ministerios y las gobernaciones y lo que son los municipios. La Autoridad Provincial de Madre Tierra es una entidad de estrategia autárquica que funciona con 3 mecanismos operativos. El mecanismo conjunto trabaja con un enfoque holístico territorial, más lo que es en manejo integral sustentable de bosques y sistemas de vida, y es territorial su trabajo. Otro mecanismo de adaptación, en la cual estoy a cargo de esta dirección, trabajamos con programas, lo que es relacionado a lo que es seguridad alimentaria, luego lo que es de prevención y reducción de riesgo, gestión integral del agua, salud y educación, lo que es sobre cambio climático. Otra de las direcciones es mecanismo de mitigación. Se refiere a todo lo que es aquellos sectores que generan lo que son gases de efecto invernadero. Entonces, por lo tanto, estos 3 mecanismos con los que trabaja la Autoridad Provincial de Tierra. También tenemos una articulación intergobernativa, interinstitucional, gestión de conocimiento y, como les he indicado, lo que es el Fondo Plurianual Madre Tierra. También la Autoridad Provincial Madre Tierra participa en las negociaciones internacionales, por lo tanto, en la mayoría de las actividades internacionales que ha sido relacionadas al cambio climático, hemos sido partícipes, y ahí podemos ver las imágenes también, y de qué se trata ahí, más que todo, nosotros tenemos bastante prioridad en la cuestión de agricultura, relacionado a lo que es adaptación, también lo que es financiamiento climático, ¿para qué? Para la apertura de nuevos enfoques bolivianos. Otro, protección de la madre tierra. Este es uno de los plus de Bolivia, de que nosotros tenemos una ley constituida, lo que es derecho de la madre tierra. Mecanismos de compensación sobre daños y pérdidas también. Y financiamiento y transferencia de tecnología. Pasamos a otro acápite que es lo más importante en este evento que estamos. Se trata de integración de conocimientos indígenas y marcos legales en Bolivia, que son desafíos ambientales y limitaciones. Bueno, acá vemos en la imagen que ella es la hermana Angélica Ponce, ella es la directora ejecutiva de la Autoridad Provincial Madre Tierra, que estamos viendo en la imagen. Pasamos a la parte de lo que es marco legal. Se trata de las leyes clave para los derechos de los pueblos indígenas en Bolivia. Y acá en la diapositiva tenemos las siguientes normativas. Bolivia, en su Constitución Política de Estado, que ha sido promulgada en 2009, ya reconoce la diversidad, ¿no? Lo que es étnica y derechos a la autonomía y consulta previa. Otra de las leyes que tenemos, la Ley de Autonomías de 2010, que permite autonomías indígenas, por eso que tenemos hoy en día autonomías indígenas que ya no son como municipios, sino que tienen su propia autonomía, pues lo que es Raja y Pampa, por ejemplo, ¿no? Otro, también tenemos de Charagua. Otro, tenemos Ley de Consulta Previa 2013. Bolivia garantiza consulta en proyectos afectando a lo que es a indígenas. 4. Ley de Disciplina de 2015. Resuelve conflictos territoriales indígenas. 5. Ley de Derechos Indígenas. En 2018, Bolivia, desde el nivel central de Estado como Estado, reconoce lo que es autodeterminación y conocimientos tradicionales. Por último, podemos indicar también que tenemos mucho más leyes, pero otra de las leyes es Ley 338, 2013, Ley de Organizaciones Económicas Campesinas e Indígenas Originarias, que llamamos OICAS, y de Organizaciones Económicas Comunitarias, OICOM, ¿no? Voy avanzando acá. Entidades y organizaciones clave para los pueblos indígenas en Bolivia. Hay entidades específicas que tienen, ¿cómo se puede decir?, funciones y competencias de velar de lo que son pueblos indígenas. En este caso, la Autoridad Plurinacional de Madre Tierra es una de las entidades que, por lo cual ha podido hacer un establecimiento o fortalecimiento de plataformas consultivas territoriales, sectoriales o por programas, ¿no? Entonces, esta plataforma, lo que en la PMT es una de sus competencias y funciones de impulsar. Otro es Ministerio de Justicia, en la cual garantiza igualdad de derechos y justicia intercultural. Otro, Viceministerio de Descolonización, promueve la descolonización y lucha contra la discriminación, siempre en favor de lo que son los pueblos indígenas. Pacto de Unidad es una alianza nacional, ¿no? Esto es constante evolución de las organizaciones de base de Bolivia que apoyan los derechos indígenas y agrarios. La conformas, lo que es Pacto de Unidad conforman las organizaciones nacionales, ¿no? Esta es SUTCB, lo que son de Bartolina Sisa, SUTCB es Confederación Sindical Única de Trabajadores Campesinos de Bolivia, otro es Confederación Nacional de Mujeres Indígenas de Bolivia, lo que es Bartolina Sisa, Consejo Nacional de Marcas y Ayllus CONAMAC, Confederación de Pueblos Indígenas de Bolivia, que es SIDO, y lo que son de interculturales. Otra de las entidades que también se hace cargo, lo que es para los pueblos indígenas, es Defensoría del Pueblo. Supervisa y protege los derechos humanos, incluyendo los indígenas. Desde la PMT se constituye lo que es las plataformas, pero una de las plataformas es la plataforma de Naciones Indígenas Originarias Campesinas de lucha contra el cambio climático. Esta plataforma es específico conformada de la PMT que se ha impulsado. Otro que tenemos es la plataforma de jóvenes por la justicia climática y también tenemos plataforma de mujeres de lucha contra el cambio climático. Y si acá vemos las fotos, realmente estas plataformas funcionan con bastante concurrencia y aquí la hermana Angélica en algún momento, por ejemplo, las plataformas de los jóvenes hace lo que es la juramentación, ¿no? Por lo tanto, las plataformas de la Autoridad Provincial Madre Tierra, en este caso de lo que son Naciones Indígenas Originarias Campesinas de lucha contra el cambio climático, ha sido constituida legalmente con la resolución administrativa 062 de 2019, del 30 de septiembre de 2019, por la Autoridad Provincial Madre Tierra. Y otro que recientemente ha tenido que validarse, la resolución administrativa número 023-2023, la cual recién este año, el 22 de junio de 2023, se hace la constitución oficial con su estatuto y reglamento del funcionamiento de lo que es de la plataforma de pueblos indígenas. La plataforma de naciones y pueblos indígenas originarios campesinas de lucha contra el cambio climático tiene el objetivo de impulsar la generación de mecanismos que permitan recuperar, fortalecer y aplicar las prácticas, conocimientos y saberes ancestrales para enfrentar al cambio climático a nivel nacional e internacional. Esta plataforma funciona de la siguiente manera. Tiene un comité facilitador en la cual tenemos 3 representantes de la Asamblea Legislativa. Estas representantes tienen que ser de la región del Altiplano, región del Valle y región de Llanos. Y tenemos que tener ahí también 6 representantes de las organizaciones indígenas, originarias, campesinas e interculturales, en la cual están lo que es de Confederación Sindical Única de Trabajadores de Bolivia, lo que es Tupac-Catay llamamos, también de las Bartolinas, lo que es de CONAMAC, de Marcas y Ayllus, también de los interculturales, ¿no? Y también tenemos los de CITOP, que llamamos Confederación de Indígenas de Bolivia. Y además tenemos 3 representantes del ámbito académico, quienes son son universidades que están ubicados en las diferentes regiones que son de pueblos indígenas. Por ejemplo, Universidad Boliviana Aymara, Universidad Boliviana Quechua, Universidad Boliviana Guaraní. Estas universidades han sido constituidas durante la presidencia del presidente Evo y estos son parte de lo que es la conformación del comité de facilitador de lo que son de pueblos indígenas. Y tenemos ahí un representante de la Autoridad Provincial de Tierra. Esta es la Secretaría Técnica que tiene, nosotros somos los que tenemos que impulsar todas las convocatorias de cómo tiene que funcionar todo, ¿no? Y excepcionalmente un representante de una entidad pública relacionada al cambio climático. En este caso, puede ser de Medellín, puede ser Ministerio de Medio Ambiente y Agua, bueno, en su momento se define, ¿no? Y tenemos a partir de eso comisiones de trabajo, hay una Secretaría Técnica, plataforma ampliada, y esta plataforma ampliada ya participan de estas organizaciones que conforman lo que es comité facilitador, todos los que puedan. Por eso son de bastante concurrencia esas reuniones. Voy pasando acá. Plataforma de Naciones Indígenas Originarias de lucha contra el cambio climático. Las actividades que se realizan, o sea, que se han realizado hasta el momento son los siguientes. Se han realizado encuentros regionales, ¿no? Y también se tiene control de asistencia del comité facilitador. Aquí en las reuniones seriamente se manejan. También se tuvo lo que son encuentros regionales y programa de gestión territorial del cambio climático se está elaborando en Bolivia netamente para lo que son pueblos indígenas. Otro documento que es binacional, ¿no? Se trata sobre lo que son prácticas y conocimientos ancestrales, ¿no? Esto en el sistema TDPS, que es un acuerdo binacional entre Perú y Bolivia, y en este documento lo que se va a mostrar es todos los saberes y conocimientos ancestrales sistematizados, ¿no? Por último, tenemos el curso de formación continua de base para la negociación climática. Actualmente este curso está en pleno desarrollo, en la cual los miembros de la plataforma de pueblos indígenas participan activamente y se capacitan en qué consiste la negociación climática. Pasamos a la parte de integración de conocimientos, prácticas indígenas en Bolivia. Bueno, Bolivia es un país, ¿no? Tiene bastante diversidad cultural y étnica que se refleja en diferentes prácticas, ¿no? Tenemos conocimientos de sus pueblos indígenas, sin embargo, a pesar de esta riqueza, al momento lo que vemos es la falta de integración de estos conocimientos y prácticas en base a lo que son marcos legales. Lo que falta es realmente consolidar en la parte práctica, ¿no? Si nos referimos a lo que son conocimientos y prácticas indígenas originarios en Bolivia, en cuanto a lo que son conocimientos y prácticas, están vinculados a la conservación ambiental. Estas comunidades han desarrollado técnicas sostenibles que mantienen una armonía con la naturaleza. Va mucho más allá. Estos conocimientos y prácticas no se limitan solamente a recursos naturales, sino que abarcan aspectos culturales y espirituales intrínsecamente vinculados a la preservación ambiental. Muchos pueblos indígenas consideran la naturaleza sagrada y la protegen. Por eso es que se tiene en Bolivia, además, lo que es la ley 071, que se trata de los derechos de la madre tierra. Y está bien concatenado con todo lo que es la ideología de lo que son pueblos indígenas. También se tienen limitaciones para la integración efectiva. ¿Cuáles son? La falta de comprensión que en algún momento existe y lo que es falta de reconocimiento de la importancia de los conocimientos de los pueblos indígenas en Bolivia. Eso limita su integración, ¿no? En lo que son políticas ambientales. Otro es falta de coordinación interinstitucional y diálogo intercultural, los cuales son obstáculos para la efectiva integración de conocimientos indígenas y políticas ambientales en Bolivia. Otro también podemos indicar que es falta de reconocimiento y valoración. ¿A qué nos referimos? La falta de reconocimiento de conocimientos indígenas en Bolivia es un obstáculo para su integración en políticas ambientales. A menudo se marginan y consideran primitivos en comparación con el conocimiento occidental, cuando el conocimiento ancestral de los pueblos indígenas es para afrontar lo que es para la adaptación al cambio climático, y eso está comprobado. En Bolivia los pueblos indígenas tienen sus propios saberes, bastantes saberes, y que eso se debe sistematizar. Por eso es que se está trabajando en lo que es el sistema TDPS, ¿no? Y debemos también valorar lo que es la sabiduría ancestral, ¿no? Como parte de la cultura y patrimonio nacional. Las dificultades para la implementación. ¿Qué es lo que pasa? Existe la falta de comprensión y valoración de los saberes indígenas, y esto es clave en Bolivia. Además, la falta de coordinación entre instituciones dificulta su integración en políticas ambientales. Pero hasta el momento, desde la APMT, al impulsar la conformación de la plataforma de pueblos indígenas, hemos avanzado bastante y están muy conscientes las organizaciones nacionales, tanto de mujeres, varones y diferentes organizaciones que conforman ahí. Ellos están en pleno conocimiento de esto tiene que acabar. Es decir, nosotros en Bolivia tenemos que consolidar. Si voy avanzando acá, también existe la falta de coordinación interinstitucional. Esto nos referimos a más que todo a lo que es a nivel de lo que son ministerios y también la gobernación en lo que son los municipios. Entonces, en este caso, es muy complejo la parte estructural. Hay veces hay una duplicación de esfuerzos, pero por lo cual la APMT se constituye una de las entidades que impulsa lo que es la plataforma Pueblos Indígenas. Desde aquí, desde lo que es la plataforma Pueblos Indígenas, se tiene que sacar lo que son las conclusiones, las sugerencias, hasta lo que es a nivel del central del Estado, y todo lo que se tiene que cómo afrontar lo que es cambio climático. Hay una necesidad de una perspectiva intercultural, ¿no? Se refiere a lo que son la integración de conocimientos indígenas en políticas ambientales en Bolivia, porque requiere una perspectiva intercultural que valora la diversidad cultural. Esto tiene que promover, ¿no?, la colaboración, que se tiene que reconocer la importancia de ambos tipos de conocimiento. Como ejemplos de buenas prácticas tenemos en Bolivia, que acá en la presentación lo que mencionas, en la región de Reserva Eduardo Baroa, por ejemplo, existe una protección de biodiversidad y también se promueve el turismo. Allá se tiene pues el recurso agua como un paisaje muy bastante interesante, están los nevados ahí, y en esas pampas podemos ver pues cómo están estos, lo que son las vicuñas, ¿no? Por ahí tienen que, andan, es que son silvestres, pero son cuidados ahí por los pueblos indígenas de lo que el sector del que Reserva Eduardo Baroa. Y allá tenemos flamencos muy interesantes. Y allá realmente cuando uno va, puede quedarse a sacar fotografías, muchas cosas. Entonces, este es uno de los ejemplos de buenas prácticas que se realiza en Bolivia. Y hay muchas, ¿no? Y sería bastante tiempo que ocupar. Como conclusión, nosotros reconocemos y valoramos lo que son saberes ancestrales, ¿no?, lo que son pueblos indígenas. Para nosotros es clave en políticas ambientales en Bolivia. Y lo que nos falta es un poco superar la falta de coordinación que existe, y también tenemos la perspectiva intercultural. Para nosotros esto es crucial, ¿no? Entonces, también tenemos los ejemplos exitosos que inspiran a nosotros como una cultura de respeto y valoración. Es lo que podemos indicar desde acá de Bolivia, desde la Autoridad Provincial de Madre Tierra, y saludarles a nombre de la hermana Angélica Ponce y las 3 direcciones que trabajamos acá. No somos harto personas, somos poco, pero tenemos una responsabilidad bastante grande, y en Bolivia se está desarrollando con mayor énfasis todo lo que son relacionados a lo que son pueblos indígenas. Eso es lo que puedo indicarles. Si tienen alguna consulta, estoy dispuesto a absorber para poder responder las preguntas. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Herman. So we have a few moments, about 10 minutes, 12 minutes, to ask questions of our presenters, Gwen and Herman. So by all means, please, if you have questions, you can enter them into the chat. And alternatively, we have a micro board that's functioning. And by all means, you can post it into the micro board. So to get the conversation going, I guess I would ask either Gwen or Herman.
Hold on, Margot. I think Herman is still sharing his screen.
Oh, sorry. Herman, you stop sharing?
Estás compartiendo la pantalla todavía, Herman. Gracias.
Thank you. Okay. Perfect, thank you. So Gwen or Herman, wonderful presentations. And I wonder, first of all, if there was something that could happen that would advance Indigenous laws and sovereignty and pluralism. What would be the biggest single most important change that could be made and advanced in order to do so and combat the obstacles that you both identified?
Yeah, thanks, Margot. I think that in British Columbia, as an example, but it applies to many jurisdictions, the most important consideration, actually the only way that we found in doing our analysis across the multiple First Nations, 208 in British Columbia, that the advancement of legal pluralism and Indigenous abilities to implement their knowledge and laws within their landscapes is predicated on 2 main sort of contextual policy advancements, right? Firstly, that government-to-government relationships between the state actors and the First Nations have one main function. That's to empower the implementation of regional/Indigenous decision-making based on Indigenous knowledge and law. So the second component is then that we need to establish these bodies that think through the challenges, and they could be bodies which result in, collaborative 50-50 implementation of the both sets of knowledge, or they could be an agreement to unilaterally implement Indigenous decisions, law, and management within those regions. So there's this functionality of the larger government-to-government empowering relationship. That empowerment, the mechanism of that relationship is to empower the regional decision-making bodies. In order to be consistent with the Western framework of law, there are mechanisms to ensure that the quote-unquote statutory decision makers, that are the decision makers on the Western side, are considered in processes that fall outside of that regional decision-making board, reflect the state government, but are really, in fact, a mechanism of final enabling of that regional decision-making. And there are models coming out of Canada in the national park, the new National Park Reserve negotiation systems, which really think through the relationship necessary to establish those regional entities that manage that land, and how then to not fetter some of those statutory decision makers within the federal and provincial constraints. So there's sort of a conceptual policy structure for making that happen. When Indigenous people have said, this is what we need, this is sort of that translation service, if you will, that I've been providing to say, well, this is how we could begin to think around what those sort of structural changes would be on the provincial side, in this case provincial, but again applicable in terms of thinking through that challenge across multiple jurisdictions. Thank you, Margot. Hope that was helpful.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up. So you said state to state, and in the Canadian example, the federal government is generally the entity, the nation-to-nation relationship with Indigenous people. But are you also referring to the British Columbia government?
Yeah, state meaning sort of the state actors, right? Whether that's a federal state or a sub-state, right? So it's something that comes out of that more colonial system. So it could be federal or it could be provincial, or in the US state, or whatever the sort of sub-jurisdictions are. So the nation-to-nation relationship needs to be well, we don't have to get into sort of the unique nuance of the British Columbia context in terms of that, but it could be the federal government, it could be the provincial government, depending on, where the treaties are, whether it's ceded or unceded, this kind of conversation. So.
Right. No, thank you for that. And so to me, it's two interesting examples with Canada, which is working as described by Gwen, and then Herman, your description of what's going on in Bolivia, which is a fantastic institution that you're representing for Mother Earth, but yet some significant challenges under coordination. So is it that that more legal power is needed for Mother Earth, or is there another action that could overcome the barriers that you mentioned?
Sí, lo que ha ido pasando es lo siguiente, si bien las leyes están ahí, es bastante avanzado, se ha podido tratar de consolidar, pero no había una entidad que pueda aglutinar a lo que son nivel central de Estado, que llamamos los ministerios, las entidades encargadas de los que son derechos de pueblos indígenas, en todas las acciones, ¿no? Lo que es la gobernanza mismo de sus territorios, pero el Estado garantiza, por eso es que se ha hecho las titulaciones en forma comunitaria para los pueblos indígenas, ha ido consolidando. Entonces, ¿qué significa esto? La Autoridad Plurinacional de Madre Tierra, una de sus funciones, y por ley mismo tenemos la fortaleza de poder ser impulsor como entidad, de poder aglutinar a todo esto y direccionar, dar encauce como tiene que ser. Y eso es lo que ha sucedido el día 22 con la resolución administrativa, lo que es 23, entonces, en la cual han estado presentes altas autoridades y en la cual han estado todas las organizaciones y los pueblos indígenas. Entonces, esta es una fortaleza desde Bolivia para que ellos hasta van a poder ser partícipes en lo que son las negociaciones internacionales. Ellos en esta plataforma tienen esa posibilidad de hacer conocer las necesidades, qué es lo que sienten. Entonces, y ahí todos los demás, lo que son ministerios, tienen que acoplarse. Entonces, de esa forma se está encarando. Entonces, la PMT es la entidad realmente, y aparte de eso, algo más quiero indicarle. Esta entidad está dirigida por una mujer de pollera, que es la hermana Angélica Ponce, ¿no? Y es una mujer campesina, y como su nombre es Autoridad por la Madre Tierra, y es una mujer que dirige también, ¿no? Entonces, trabajamos aquí arduamente, pero los pueblos indígenas aquí tienen una parte como una garantía de que desde aquí se tienen que impulsar y que todos los ministerios deben entender el cumplimiento de todas las normativas que existen en Bolivia, desde la Constitución y otras normativas específicas. Si alguna consulta más.
Thank you. Actually, we've got a few minutes, so both for you, Herman and Gwen. So I'm struck by the diversity of Indigenous practices and plurinational laws, and there's a great diversity. So even in some of my very, and I apologize for them, colonial questions, we talk about integration, but what's the danger of integrating and simplifying, and we lose the diverse voices? So how do we advance the diversity of Indigenous laws?
I can go. I think
Hola,
that
hola.
it's
Bueno, siga adelante.
I think it's got to do with this notion of the creation of those enabling mechanisms, right? The jurisdiction of the federal and the provincial government in Canada and the US government, for example, takes a very large scale process to think through its broad, huge jurisdiction, right? And it's too large for the reflections that predate colonialism, right? And so the context of the how we understand, in my view, the necessary evolution of what Canada as a nation state looks like to better reflect regional decision making is a question not yet answered. But in terms of the ability to create equity, justice, reconciliation, these questions that you've asked, Margot, are the essential questions that we need to be thinking about, because certainly diversity of perspective about the functionality and the relevancy of the nation state also exists within Indigenous peoples. Some are like, I endorse the nation state of Canada. Others are like, I don't endorse the nation state of Canada. So, how we're having those dialogues amongst Indigenous people is important too. The advancement of capacity and thinking through these complex jurisdictional models also needs to be grown within the Indigenous populations as well, so we can put forth more models which begin to provide scenarios that might be part of the solution space for this question. But it's an important and relevant question. Thank you.
Thank you, Gwen. And Herman, any comments?
Sí, quiero argumentar algo más. La plataforma de pueblos indígenas en Bolivia, al tener desde lo que son, desde la Cámara de Diputados, que son de diferentes regiones, y asimismo conforman ahí la parte académica, que son las universidades indígenas, tanto lo que es guaraní, quechua, aymara, y también por conformar lo que son organizaciones sociales de diferentes, lo que son del sector quechua, guaraní, y son organizaciones nacionales que aglutinan. Para nosotros es una forma de integrar, y ahí se respeta su forma de pensar, todo. Entonces, esto se va a mantener, por eso es que tienen sus propias universidades constituidas ahí, y tienen representantes nacionales a nivel de Cámara de Diputados mismo, ¿no? Y la PMT es una entidad que, como es una secretaría técnica, impulsa todas sus actividades hasta de poder facilitar acceso a los fondos para su funcionamiento de la plataforma. Nada más y muchas gracias.
Thank you so much for that. And that's a wonderful lead up to our next shorter segment, where we have Anna from the IAI and Nicole from the Belmont Forum, and they are going to be talking about what is being done or can be done from their institutions and in order to advance effective integration of Indigenous peoples' knowledges and practices and the Western legal framework. So first of all, we have Anna.
Thank you, Margot. I really want to applaud and thank Gwen and Herman for those fantastic presentations. And I'm so thrilled that we are here having this conversation today, because Gwen and we met more than last year in December and began this conversation in Montreal during the COP, the Conference of the Parties of the CBD, the Convention on Biodiversity. And we discussed the importance of having dialogue across the Americas and understanding what was happening in different countries and beginning to come together. And Herman, thank you also as our focal point with Bolivia. Just Bolivia is such a leading voice in the region on these issues. So just a little bit about the organization I work with, the IAI, the Inter-American Institute for Global Change Research. We are an intergovernmental organization serving 19 countries of the Americas, including Canada and Bolivia. We were founded 30 years ago via a treaty between the member states, and our mission was and continues to be supporting the creation of scientific information and the use of that information for decision-making and science related to global change processes, which is a pretty big umbrella, but can be understood as things like biodiversity loss, climate change, water, oceans, atmosphere, human urbanization, human movement, and how these things are all interconnected. And so today, our work is really focused on transdisciplinary science and transdisciplinary approaches to coming up with solutions to these complex issues around global change processes. So just very briefly, what is transdisciplinary science? Transdisciplinary science has emerged as it's a growing trend, I would say, in the sciences over the last 10, 15 years. And it means that we're bringing together different disciplines, like from across the social sciences, the natural sciences, with the perspectives and the knowledge of those who are outside of academia, be it local communities, Indigenous peoples, governments, private sector, depending on what the question is that's being addressed. So bringing together these groups with different ways of knowing and seeing the world and different methodologies to jointly address a question and come up with a solution. And so transdisciplinary science is inherently inclusive and participatory and problem-driven. So it's very much an applied way of seeing the world. And it's really, from my perspective, transdisciplinary science has a big focus on how we work together and how we partner. So what are the ethical ways that we come together within also understanding the boundaries of current Western science and the unethical and exclusionary practices that have persisted. And so transdisciplinary science is questioning that and is inherently decolonial. So thinking about decolonization of science, how we can, again, critically look at whose ways of knowledge and whose methodologies have been valued and who has not, and how we can create different spaces, again, to come together to solve the problems that are facing humanity. So at the II, again, our science agenda is wholly focused now on transdisciplinary science. We fund research and we also implement projects, and we do quite a bit around capacity building and training and developing networks across the Americas, especially networks that have multinational networks. So bringing together people from different countries to tackle issues that require knowledge from different countries that can't be done by one nation alone. So at the IAI, a few years back, our member states raised the importance of creating a new policy on gender equity, diversity, and inclusion. And this policy was drafted and it was presented during our Conference of the Parties in 2022, and it was adopted. This was, I think, a really important moment for the organization because it's now shaping all the work that we do, and the policy is available online. I can drop the link in the chat afterwards. So over the last year, we worked on the implementation of the policy, and one of the main recommendations that came out of the committee was to establish an advisory body comprised of Indigenous peoples and local communities to guide the work of the II, specifically to guide the Conference of the Parties. That means our government representatives from across the Americas, and to guide the implementation of our science agenda. What's really interesting is that this advisory body would sit side by side and be an equal with the long-standing 30-year existing Science Advisory Committee and the slightly more contemporary Science Policy Advisory Committee. So now we have 3 advisory bodies that sit as equals at the table, and these bodies are the main voices that advise the member states in terms of what actions to take related to science and how investment should be made in the region. And so this year we are in the process of working to establish that committee, and I'm really, really excited. I think that that will actually radically transform the work that we do at the organization and going forward. So we are also at this point working with the Belmont Forum. We are actually the host of the Belmont Forum. Nicole will tell you more about that when she speaks. The Belmont Forum brings together science funders from around the world to address different critical research issues, and we come up with joint funding calls. These are multilateral funding calls. And so the II has been working on a funding call with this FAPESP, the Science Funding Agency of Sao Paulo, focused on the Amazon region and tropical forests. This is a global funding call, and so there will be other funders around the world that will participate in the funding call. But what's important is that we have been working this last year to identify the priorities that will be included in this funding call through a series of scoping workshops where we've invited key partners from across the region, experts, Indigenous peoples and local communities, representatives and scientists, funders, and other partners working in this space to identify the key priorities for the funding call. And we're in the process now of finalizing and making available the document that will come out of that series of scoping workshops, not only in the Americas, but also in Africa and Asia regions. One of the critical priorities is that the funding call must be centered on Indigenous peoples and local communities who must play a leadership role in the development and implementation of the science itself. And so we're really excited to continue to work on that. And we anticipate that that funding call will be launched in the middle of 2024. So please keep an eye on that. And I'm going to stop there, Margot, and happy to take any questions as well. You're on mute.
Thank you. I don't see any questions at the moment, but Rebecca can let me know if I'm misreading the micro, but we will move to Nicole. Over to you.
All right, thank you, everybody. And I'm going to start by apologizing in advance. My plan was not to be sitting in an airport and doing this at exactly the same time, but here we are. So if it gets a little bit noisy, I hopefully we'll be able to get past that. So hello, everybody. My name is Nicole Arbor. I introduced myself quickly at the beginning, but I know there will be new people who will be here. I'm the executive director of the Belmont Forum. And, you know, I have the privilege of following after Anna because she's already explained a little bit of the concept behind transdisciplinary research and why it's so important. And so the Belmont Forum is, at its core, is an institution that works to create multilateral funding calls through partnerships with international funders. And we do this in order to create spaces, create opportunities to work together on global environmental change challenges. These are the big challenges that we're all experiencing in our daily lives, those ones that transcend geopolitical borders. And what's really important in this context as well is not only are we working in a multilateral space, but we're also working in a transdisciplinary space. So all of the work that is funded through the Belmont Forum process is aimed at that creation of those spaces, of those groups, of those opportunities, and actually requires them. So any project that is funded through a Belmont Forum process must have natural scientists, must have social scientists, but very importantly to this discussion, but to all discussions, frankly, it also must have inclusion of interested parties, and those interested parties can include Indigenous communities, they can include NGOs, they can include policymakers, they can include the private sector. But the important part is that the challenges that we are trying to address are framed in a real world context. And how does that apply to this conversation, you may ask? Because one of the things that we strive to do in the context of the Belmont Forum is, in a global landscape, we try to enable these difficult conversations. We try to create those spaces where people are going to come together. I like to, some of the words I like to use are we like to foster unlikely partnerships and difficult conversations. And so we worked together with my team, who are the ones who brought together this amazing group of people to make us think about how we bring these two legal systems together and create these shared spaces. And then in addition to the way that that works, we also, so within the different funding calls, we also, for every funding call, every multilateral funding call that is created by the Belmont Forum, I say by the Belmont Forum, but it's really our members, every one of those goes through what Anna described as a scoping process. And those scoping processes are intended to help us to understand and better interact with the global community, to really understand what are those global challenges and how do we frame the funding call in such a way that everybody sees themselves reflected in the way, in the call itself, and empowered to participate in that call, empowered to develop and lead in these conversations. And in 2019, I think it was, the Belmont Forum underwent a 10-year review. And in that 10-year review, there's always all those lovely motherhood statements that say you're doing wonderful things. But one of the critical aspects that came out of that 10-year review that I took on when I took on this role is that you can't do global environmental change research without engaging with those peoples who are being most impacted by that research. And so this is something that we take to heart in the way that we engage with the conversations. And so we are really working towards a more effective engagement with the community. One of the other things that we do in order to help support these kinds of conversations is we work with our partners at Future Earth and a host institution. Last year, it was the IAI, and so we were very happy to be able to work with Anna. And then we developed the Sustainability Research and Innovation Congress. And I like to describe this as not your grandmother's conference, because the idea here is to foster conversations. It is to create learning spaces. And this year, I was very, very, very happy with the outcomes. So this year, in June of 2023, it was held in Panama City, Panama. And it was the first time ever that we were able to host the conference, fully interpreted into Spanish, which really allowed the whole of the Americas to really participate fully. So we had students who were coming from Spanish-speaking universities who were able to participate. We had many Indigenous communities who came out and participated in the conference. And the thing that makes me very proud, and I think I share this with others, is that there was enough Indigenous participation in the conference itself that they came together and they decided that they wanted to produce an output for us. They wanted to share with us their reflections on the event. And so we got basically a document that provided us with a roadmap forward, things that we need to consider to more effectively engage with the Indigenous communities and to bring them better into these conversations. And so while we are not a legal organization and we are not an intergovernmental organization, the Belmont Forum works towards fostering these conversations. And hopefully the work that we do will help to enable a little bit more and create some of those spaces that will allow communities to feel empowered to have these difficult conversations and to help us find ways to create those projects that will take things forward in a stepwise manner. And we work very closely with the IAI, being a part of living within that space. So we work with them on the EDI policies and principles, and many within those frameworks as well. So that's just a few bits and pieces of how the Belmont Forum tries to work on a global level with some of these really important conversations. I hope that, and I'm happy to answer any questions, and hopefully we can also hear from the rest of our wonderful speakers, because it's been a fascinating and fantastic panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole and Anna. We actually do have a couple questions that I think are actually appropriate for any of our 4 panelists. The first is, what are the main challenges you can identify in the global scale when co-developing science with principal investigators or other stakeholders?
Do you want me to take that one first on the global scale?
I'll say that, well, I think one of the principal challenges is the incentive structure and how academia is organized. And academia, particularly the way that it's modeled in the global north, disincentivizes collaboration, to be blunt, disincentivizes doing transdisciplinary science, doing research that has products or that focuses on impact and that's applied. And so researchers are not recognized for the efforts that they do to build and develop partnerships and collaborations, to publish papers with many co-authors in ways that are equitable. You know, for example, having the people from the communities or the local authors be the first author, as it should be. That is not recognized or valued when you're going up for a tenure. Training people from other parts of the world, not recognized or valued, I think. So there are many ways within the current academic incentive structure, I think, that really disincentivizes also publications, you know, publications primarily in high-ranked English journals are what is valued. So if you're publishing other kinds of products, you're publishing non-academic products, you're publishing in other languages, this is not recognized or valued. I could go on, but I think a major issue is that. And so researchers are humans like anyone. They're going to respond to the environment that they're in, and they're going to respond to the incentives. It's not about being good or bad people. You know, they still want to be able to have a job and have security and put their food on the table, support their family. And so I don't think we can just leave it up to the researchers to all of a sudden, you know, do science in a completely different way. Certainly there are people who are, but we need to provide an environment that allows that to happen and incentivizes equitable and just partnerships.
Great. And Nicole?
I was going to say, and I'll jump in right here, particularly because one of the, I mean, it feeds directly into the other main challenge that we do find is making sure that as we're bringing all of these partners into the projects. And so first, you know, the challenge, of course, as Anna said, but then finding funders that also support non-academic players within the research system. So the academic funding system is really developed to fund researchers who are associated with academic institutions. But we all know that expertise does not all come from an academic space. And as Anna mentioned very accurately, everybody needs a roof over their head. They need to be able to feed their kids. And so asking people to participate in these conversations in an in-kind way is not acceptable or appropriate, right? And so we need to find ways to equitably bring people into the conversation and equitably compensate them for the time, the effort, and all of the work that they're doing. And so this is something that is very challenging in this landscape because it's sadly atypical. It is not the way that we have worked in the past. And so we are, from the Belmont Forum side, we're definitely working to engage with some of those non-traditional funders, those groups that have more targeted community-based approaches, because they're also going to see more value in engaging with these conversations. So this is something that is in development, but it is also a really big challenge when working in this space.
Great. Thanks, Nicole. There's another question on the micro that I'm going to go to. And Pablo, I see you have your hand up. If you could put your question in the chat, that would be great. We're close to coming to the end of our time, so chat-based questions would be wonderful. So I'll move to the micro question, and it's for all of our panelists, but Gwen and Herman may have a take on this. It's, are legal frameworks changing or adapting in other regions of the world? Any take on this? And it's also open to Nicole or Anna as well. Gwen, over to you.
Yeah, I appreciate Anna reflecting on the desire to have these types of conversations so that we can cross-learn. It's really important, I think, to learn from Bolivia. I'm not aware of a whole lot of countries which are shifting shifting in really dramatic ways. I mean, there's examples for some of the legal rights for nature things coming out of New Zealand, and Australia has some good collaborative management examples. But in terms of the example of Bolivia, and in Canada, the desire to sort of fundamentally question the colonial state authority through mechanisms of its own policy making, I'm not really that familiar with. So.
Perfect. Thank you. And I have to mention, I just got back from Bangladesh and Nepal, and there's very many Indigenous peoples that are keenly interested in this topic, this area, and advancing this type of research, and will be very interested in the Belmont's upcoming funding call. So maybe not receiving the publicity or recognition yet, but as scholars and researchers, there's just so much that needs to be done. So I see that Pablo put his question in the chat, and I'm missing it now. Rebecca, did you catch it?
Oh yeah, sorry. I instantly went to try to look for the answer because I don't know it off the top of my head. Maybe Nicole or Fanny or you actually could. So do any of you know a specific example, so a project that's already been funded via the Belmont Forum process that works with Indigenous groups?
I know of at least one that I can speak to immediately, and maybe Fanny will know of others. But this is a call that finished already, and it was a project within our T2S, our T2S collaborative research action, and it involved research with 3 different countries, and the partnership in Brazil was directly with the Indigenous peoples. And for those people from IAI, it's Lila's project actually. And I know this because Lila, who is a step fellow of the IAI, is actually one of the most wonderful transdisciplinary researchers I know, and she works very closely with that community. And she was the first person to tell me, "Hey, I got Belmont Forum funding." And I was working with these wonderful Indigenous communities. And the way that the project was built was because the conversation was, the project came from the conversation with the community about what they needed. And for me, this was one of the most wonderful examples, and which is why I remember it, but I don't remember the exact name of the project. So after I finish talking, I will be able to go and look on the website and see what it is, or quickly ask Lila, because I know she's told me before. But that is definitely one of the ones. I know also, actually, we currently have a project within our Oceans call where they're working with the local communities, the local Indigenous communities within Madagascar. And that one is looking at
that was the one I'm thinking of.
Yeah.
I'm having trouble coming up with names. Pablo, the answer is yes, and we will get you more information.
Yeah, so that one is called Reef Restore, I think is the name that project. So if either Fanny or Becca could put into the chat the Arms Restore, that's what it is. Thank you. Fanny knows this one better because she's been working a lot with these groups. So there's definitely a series of different projects across the international community where we have been able to bring different Indigenous groups into the conversations.
Great. Thanks for that, Nicole and Rebecca. So we have only a brief few minutes left. So I'm going to give each of our, I think we've got 3 panelists. Anna had another commitment. She's physically at this meeting. So each of our 3 remaining panelists, and I'll go in the order that they presented, if that's not putting too much onus on you, Gwen, final concluding comments that you'd like to close this panel with.
Thank you. Well, it's been a pleasure to share and to learn. Thank you, Aman and Nicole and Anna for sharing the wonderful work that's going on. I think I'm always encouraged to learn from others about the examples that we're really pushing as Indigenous peoples within our various jurisdictions. There's a lot of support needed for these conversations, and encouraged to hear of your experiences from Nepal and places like that, where coming together to incite each other to really advance these conversations, to be validated in some of these conversations is an important place to be, and to be able to share through the Indigenous lens how these things are, desire us to be evolved, right, from the Indigenous perspective within the context of the nation state. So I'm really inspired and thankful and grateful to have been here and to be able to share and learn. Thank you.
Thanks, Gwen. And yes, I'm in the neighboring Saskatchewan, so we do have to get together. Over to you, Herman. Herman, any closing comments?
Muchas gracias. Y bueno, yo creo que ya estamos en la fase final. Agradecerles por invitarnos y somos parte de su punto focal para ahí. Y bueno, pues estamos viendo cuáles son los avances, y en Bolivia realmente damos bastante importancia porque esto viene desde la Constitución Política del Estado, y tenemos diferentes regiones también, y tenemos una buena cantidad de pueblos indígenas que están en las tierras bajas. Ellos hemos realizado lo que son como encuentros regionales, y estamos recogiendo pues para programas lo que es adaptación al cambio climático para pueblos indígenas, y eso estamos por consolidar. Y de verdad agradecido a todos los que han organizado esta conversación, y será pues en otro momento también, y por lo tanto dispuesto siempre a ser partícipes y ser parte en todos estos eventos. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Herman. The Bolivian case is just so fascinating and interesting and progressive. And last words go to Nicole.
Well, first, I would just like to thank everybody who organized and participated in this panel. It's through these kinds of conversations that we learn about each other's cultures, that we learn how to work better together, that we learn not only sometimes the things that are going right, but the things that are going wrong. And I think these are all really important parts of the process. There's always ways that we can do better in these situations, and that we can learn from one another. And I do hope to have the opportunity to, even though we're all spread out in different parts of the world, particularly today, sit down and meet and talk and engage with all of you at an individual level, and build these relationships more. Thank you for taking the time. Thank you for being here, and thank you for helping us to foster difficult conversations within an international landscape.
Okay, thank you to our panelists, Gwen, Nicole, Herman, and Anna. Thank you to the Belmont Forum, Rebecca, Fanny, of course, Anna, of course, Nicole. Thank you to the IAI, Anna, and thank you to all of our participants for your lovely questions, your attention, and your interest. It's such an important topic, and I look forward to seeing you at further events and collaborations together. Take care all, and have a good rest of your day.
Thanks so much, Margot.
Thank you. Thanks, you guys.
Thanks.
Thank you for everyone who joined us. I really appreciate it. So much rich learning.
Yeah, it was great.
My brain is full.
Gracias y hasta pronto.
See you. Goodbye.